The morning sun slipped through the tall glass windows of the city's Grand Music Academy. The building stood proud, surrounded by marble statues of famous composers and wide steps where dozens of hopefuls waited for their chance to audition. It was one of those rare days when the air felt heavy with both excitement and fear. Inside the main hall, rows of people whispered softly, some clutching their instruments, others adjusting their neat suits and dresses. Everyone wanted to be noticed. Everyone wanted a chance to belong. Amid all that noise, a young boy quietly entered through the side door. His shoes were old, his jacket a little too big, and his eyes held that look of someone who wasn't sure he belonged there. He carried no expensive instrument, no teacher by his side, only a folded sheet of paper in his hand. A few people turned to look at him and quickly looked away. He didn't fit the place. He looked more like someone who came to clean the hall than someone who came to play inside it. Still, he walked in, straight-backed but nervous, his fingers brushing the worn keys of the folded paper. He found a seat in the back, sat down quietly, and waited. At the front, on a raised platform, sat the judging panel. In the center was the director, a man known for his sharp tongue and proud smile. His reputation was both famous and feared. He was the kind of person who could make a person's dream with one word or break it with one look. The hall was silent whenever he spoke. Some said he could spot real talent in seconds. Others said he only loved to prove people wrong. One by one, the auditions began. A girl in a red dress played a bright tune on the violin. A young man followed, singing with a voice that filled the whole room. The director clapped politely for both, gave a few short comments, and moved on. Then the next performer came, and the morning stretched into noon. When the boy's number was called, his hands shook. He walked toward the stage slowly, almost unsure if his legs would keep moving. The director glanced at him over his glasses, eyebrows raised. "Next," he said flatly, already sounding bored. The boy stepped up to the piano. It was a large black grand piano, polished to shine like a mirror. He looked at it like he was seeing an old friend for the first time in years. The director looked down at the boy's name on the list, then looked back up. "Do you have a teacher?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "No training?" The director continued. The boy hesitated. "No, sir. I learned on my own." That answer made the hall stir. Some students whispered. One even chuckled under his breath. The director leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "On your own?" he repeated, pretending to sound impressed. Then, with a smirk, he turned to the other judges and said loud enough for the whole hall to hear, "Well, this should be interesting. If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here." Laughter broke out from a few corners of the room. The boy heard it but didn't react. He simply nodded once, walked to the piano, and placed his paper on the stand. His hands hovered above the keys for a moment. They were small, a little rough, but steady now. He took a deep breath. The hall grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes before something uncertain. The director looked down at his watch, expecting to be disappointed within seconds. Then the boy pressed the first key. It was soft, almost too soft to hear. Then another note followed, and another. The sound was simple, but it carried a strange kind of weight. It wasn't perfect. His fingers slipped slightly, but he didn't stop. The melody began to take shape, slow, deep, and full of emotion. It wasn't the kind of piece one plays to show skill. It was the kind one plays to tell a story. The whispers stopped. Even the director's smirk faded a little as he leaned forward without realizing it. The boy's shoulders moved with every note. His eyes closed like he was seeing something behind them. His left hand moved gently, guiding the rhythm, while his right hand told the story in sound. The tune began to grow louder. It was no longer the timid sound of someone afraid to play. It became alive, as if every key spoke. The boy wasn't performing. He was remembering. Every note was a piece of his past, every pause a memory he couldn't put into words. Outside the hall, the city's noise faded and inside time seemed to stop. For a moment, no one saw a poor boy playing an instrument. They only heard the emotion behind it. The music rose, painting pictures in the minds of everyone listening. A small house, a broken piano, a young child pressing keys by candlelight, a mother standing behind him smiling softly even when tired. The melody carried warmth, struggle, and something so pure it made people's eyes sting. The director blinked several times, caught off guard. He had heard thousands of performances, yet something in this one made him uneasy. Not because it was bad, but because it felt real. He had spent his career looking for perfection, but what he heard now was beyond perfection. It was truth, pain, and love wrapped in sound. As the final notes began to fade, the boy's breathing grew heavier. He kept his head down, lost in the music. The audience didn't move. Even the air felt still. Then slowly he lifted his hands from the piano, letting the last sound die out. For a few seconds no one clapped, not because they didn't like it, but because they didn't know how to respond. The silence was louder than any applause. The boy opened his eyes and looked around. Everyone was staring at him. The director sat completely still, his hand frozen halfway to his mouth. One of the other judges wiped his eyes quietly. The boy didn't understand what was happening. He just stood there, unsure what to do. Then the director stood up. He cleared his throat, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the right words. For once, the man who always had something clever to say was speechless. The boy waited, clutching his folded paper tightly. Finally, the director spoke, his voice quieter than before. Where did you learn to play like that?" The boy hesitated, then answered softly, "At home, sir. My mother had an old piano. I used to fix it with tape and nails." The director blinked, his expression unreadable. "And who taught you that song?" "She did," the boy said simply. "It's the only one I know by heart." The hall remained silent. Even the air conditioner's hum seemed to disappear. The director sat down slowly, his eyes on the piano. The boy stepped away from the instrument, unsure if he had done something wrong. After a few seconds, one of the judges began to clap. The sound echoed through the hall, sharp and clear. Another joined in, then another, until the whole room was on its feet. The applause grew louder, but the boy just stood there, confused, almost frightened by it. The director didn't clap right away. He just stared at the piano, then at the boy. Then slowly he rose to his feet and gave one firm clap. It was small but carried more meaning than all the others combined. The boy bowed his head slightly and turned to walk off the stage. He didn't notice the director watching him the entire time, his expression unreadable, his earlier words echoing silently in his mind. "If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here." When the boy reached the door, the director finally spoke again. "Wait," he said. The word stopped the boy mid-step. The director's voice was different now, not proud, not mocking. Just real. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Bring that song again." The boy turned slowly, his face filled with confusion and hope. He nodded once softly, then walked out of the hall. As the door closed behind him, the director leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. One of the other judges turned to him. "You were serious about what you said earlier?" he asked with a half-smile. The director didn't answer. He looked toward the piano again and said quietly, "I think I might be." Outside, the boy stepped into the sunlight. He had no idea what his performance had done inside that hall. He didn't know that the director, the one who had laughed at him, would spend that night replaying every note in his mind. All he knew was that for the first time someone had listened, truly listened. He walked down the steps holding his folded sheet close to his chest. The city's noise returned, cars honking, people shouting, but it all sounded distant now. Somewhere deep inside, the boy felt something shift. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was faith. Or maybe for the first time he believed that his music might actually matter. And far behind him, inside that grand hall, a proud man who never bowed to anyone sat quietly, staring at a piano that no longer seemed just like an instrument, but like a voice that had finally spoken. The next morning came with a sky painted in soft gold. The boy woke up early, even before the city began to move. The old clock on the wall ticked slowly, its sound echoing through the small room. He sat on the edge of his bed, his heart still beating with the memory of yesterday. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see that grand piano, hear those clapping hands, and remember the director's voice saying, "Come back tomorrow." He didn't know what those words meant. He didn't even know if the director really meant it or if it was just a polite gesture. Still, he couldn't stay away. For him, that piano was more than an instrument. It was a part of him. He washed his face, combed his hair with his fingers, and put on the same clothes he wore yesterday. They were clean but old, the color faded in places. Before leaving, he looked at a small picture on the wall, his mother's photo. She was smiling, holding him as a child, her hands covered in soap from the hotel where she used to work. "I'll make you proud, Ma," he whispered softly. Then he folded the same paper he used yesterday and placed it in his pocket. When he stepped outside, the streets were still quiet. The air was cold and the morning mist hugged the buildings. He walked for nearly an hour, taking the bus halfway, then walking again because he didn't have enough money for a full fare. His shoes made soft sounds against the pavement. He didn't mind the distance. Each step brought him closer to the piano. When he finally reached the music academy, the grand building looked even taller than before. The same marble stairs, the same large doors, and yet it all felt different now. This time, he wasn't standing outside as a stranger. He had been called back. That thought alone gave him strength. Inside the hall, things were quieter than yesterday. Only a few students were there, setting up instruments or whispering softly. The air smelled of polished wood and faint perfume. The boy stood near the back again, unsure where to go. He was early. The judges hadn't arrived yet. After a few minutes, a man in a black suit, one of the academy's assistants, walked up to him. "You're the boy from yesterday, right?" he asked with a small smile. The boy nodded. The man's voice softened. "The director asked for you. Wait here. He'll come soon." The boy sat down, clutching the folded paper in his hand. He tried to calm his heart, but it kept racing. He looked at the piano from a distance. It was the same grand black one he had played the day before. It looked powerful yet peaceful, almost like it was waiting for him. Soon the doors opened and the director walked in with two other judges. The boy stood up quickly. The director's expression was unreadable, serious but not cold. He didn't smile, didn't scold, just nodded slightly and said, "You came." "Yes, sir," the boy replied softly. The director took his seat at the panel while the other judges arranged their papers. "Play the same piece," he said simply. "This time take your time, no rush. Just play." The boy nodded and walked to the piano. The hall was empty except for the three judges. The silence felt heavy but not scary, more like the kind of silence that listens. He placed his fingers on the keys. The first note came out soft and trembling. He took a deep breath and started again, this time slower, gentler. The melody grew, and once again the hall began to fill with emotion. Every sound carried his memories. The nights when he practiced quietly so he wouldn't wake his mother. The times when the keys stuck and he'd fix them using pieces of wire. He remembered how his mother used to sit beside him, tapping the rhythm with her fingers, smiling whenever he got it right. The director watched him closely. There was something about the way the boy played. It wasn't trained, but it was alive. Each mistake blended naturally into the melody as if it belonged there. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being real. Halfway through the song, the director whispered something to one of the judges. The other nodded, still watching. None of them looked away. As the music rose and fell, the boy forgot where he was. He wasn't in a grand hall anymore. He was back in that small room with the broken piano and his mother sitting beside him. He played not to impress anyone, but to keep a promise. When the final note faded, he didn't open his eyes immediately. He sat still, hands resting on the keys, breathing quietly. The hall remained silent for a moment. Then the director spoke softly. "Do you know who composed that?" The boy shook his head. "No, sir. I just played what my mother used to hum." The director leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Sometimes," he said, almost to himself, "the most powerful songs don't belong to any composer." The boy didn't fully understand what he meant, but the tone in the director's voice made him feel something. Maybe respect, maybe disbelief. The director stood up, walked slowly to the piano and placed his hand on its surface. "You've never studied music theory?" he asked again. The boy shook his head. "No, sir. I don't know how to read notes very well." The director nodded slightly. "And yet you played with heart. That can't be taught." He turned to the other judges. "He plays with life, not just skill." One of the judges smiled. "We could train him," she said quietly. "With the right guidance, he could be exceptional." The boy didn't say a word. He stood still, unsure if this was a dream or real. After a long pause, the director looked back at him. "If I let you study here, will you work harder than anyone else?" The boy's voice shook as he answered, "I will, sir." "I promise," the director gave a short nod. "All right. Come back next week. We'll arrange something." The boy blinked, not sure if he had heard correctly.
"You mean—"
"I can study here?" The director looked away and said quietly, "We'll see." Don't waste this chance. The boy bowed deeply, his heart so full he couldn't speak. As he turned to leave, the director called out again. What's your name? The boy turned, smiling shyly. I'm just someone who loves the piano, sir. The director chuckled softly. Then keep it that way. Outside the hall, the boy's steps felt light. The whole world looked brighter. He could hardly believe what just happened. For the first time, someone had seen him. Not as a poor boy, not as a nobody, but as a musician. He walked back through the city streets, past the busy shops and honking cars, holding the folded sheet of paper close to his chest. The paper had the few notes he'd written by hand years ago, copied from his mother's humming. It wasn't fancy, but it was everything to him. He reached a small park nearby and sat on a wooden bench. Birds hopped on the grass and children laughed in the distance. He opened the folded sheet and looked at the messy pencil marks. He smiled. That simple tune, born in a tiny home, had made people in a grand hall listen in silence. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and thought of his mother again. He imagined her voice saying, "See? I told you to keep playing." At that moment, tears filled his eyes, not from sadness, but from the feeling that she was still with him somehow, guiding his fingers even when she wasn't there. That evening, as the sun began to fall behind the buildings, the director sat alone in his office at the academy. Papers were spread across his desk, but he wasn't reading them. His mind was still filled with that melody. He had heard hundreds of performers, quite trained, polished, perfect, but none of them had made him feel what that boy's song did. He replayed his own words in his mind. If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. It wasn't the boy who had to prove himself anymore. It was him. He had forgotten what music was supposed to be. Not competition, not fame, but truth. He looked out of his window at the dimming sky and whispered to himself, maybe it's time to listen again. And far away, the boy walked home, still humming that same song, his voice soft but filled with hope. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know that this moment, this one quiet audition, would change his entire life. All he knew was that something had begun, and for the first time the path ahead didn't feel so impossible. It felt like music, uncertain, beautiful, and alive. A week passed, but for the boy it felt like a dream stretched across 7 long days. Every morning he woke before the sun rose and practiced on the old piano in the community hall. The keys were chipped, the sound uneven, but to him it was enough. He wanted to be ready for whatever the director at the academy planned for him. The hall where he practiced was quiet. Dust floated through the sunlight that slipped in through the windows. Sometimes children passing by would stop and peek through the door, listening to him play. They didn't know who he was or why he played for so long, but the melody made them stand still. Each note he played carried something deeper than practice. It carried memories, some sweet, some painful. He remembered the first time he saw a piano. It was many years ago, inside the school where his mother worked as a cleaner. She used to take him with her after hours when everyone had gone home. The classrooms were empty, and the hall smelled faintly of chalk and polish. In one corner of the main hall stood a dusty old piano. He had touched it out of curiosity, pressing one key at a time, laughing when the sounds echoed. His mother had smiled at him that day and said, "If you love it, play it." That was the start of everything. From then on, every evening when she worked late, he would sit at that piano and teach himself small tunes. He didn't know what notes were or how to read music, but his ears were sharp. He'd hum simple songs he heard on the radio and try to match them on the piano. His mother used to tease him, "One day you'll make this old piano sing." And he'd grin and answer, "Only if you promise to listen." They didn't have much. Their home was small, just one room with a narrow bed, a stove, and an old fan that made a soft rattling sound. But it was filled with warmth. His mother's laughter made the whole place feel alive. She worked all day, yet every night she'd sit beside him as he played. Sometimes she'd hum along, her voice tired but full of love. Then life began to change. The school replaced the old piano with a new one, and the principal wanted to throw the old one away. His mother asked if they could take it home. It was heavy and damaged, but somehow, with help from a few neighbors, they managed to roll it into their tiny room. It barely fit. Half the piano stood in the doorway, but they didn't care. To the boy, it was the best gift in the world. The keys stuck, the pedals didn't work, and some strings buzzed, but he fixed what he could. He used tape, nails, and glue, sometimes even pieces of wire from old toys. Slowly, the piano came back to life. It was around that time his mother started coughing often. She'd wave it off and say it was just tiredness, but he could see her growing weaker. Some nights she'd sit beside him wrapped in a blanket, her voice softer now when she said, "Play something for me." And he did. The same tune again and again. It was the tune he played in the audition hall, the one she used to hum while washing clothes. He didn't know where it came from. It didn't belong to anyone else, and it was theirs. Then one evening, after a long day, she didn't come home. The boy waited for hours sitting near the piano. When the door finally opened, it was a neighbor, not his mother. She told him what happened. His mother had fallen sick at work and had been taken to the hospital. He ran there as fast as he could, his heart pounding. He found her lying in bed, her face pale, but she smiled when she saw him. She reached out her hand weakly and said, "Don't cry. You have to be strong, my little musician." He held her hand tightly, tears rolling down his face. She whispered again, "Promise me you'll keep playing, no matter what happens." He nodded, unable to speak. That was the last promise he ever made to her. When she passed away, the world suddenly felt quiet. The small home felt empty, the piano untouched. Days went by when he couldn't bring himself to play. He'd just sit near it, staring at the keys, hearing her voice in his head. Then one night, during a storm, lightning cracked outside and rain poured through the open window. The sound of thunder reminded him of the times she'd laugh when he got scared as a child. He sat at the piano again that night, closed his eyes, and played their song. Slow, broken, but full of feeling. That was the moment he realized that even though she was gone, she still lived inside the music. From then on, he played every day. The piano became his only friend. Whenever he was sad, he played. When he missed her, he played. When he wanted to talk to her, he didn't speak. He played. Years passed that way. The piano got older, the strings weaker, but the boy grew better. He played in small events at the community center, sometimes in the park, anywhere they'd let him. Some people stopped to listen. Most didn't, but he didn't care. For him, music wasn't about applause when it was about keeping her memory alive. One day, a teacher from the city heard him playing at a local event. She told him about the academy's open auditions. She even said, "You should try. You never know." He had laughed at first. How could someone like him walk into a place like that? But the thought stayed in his mind. A week later, he packed the folded paper with his song written in pencil and took the bus to the city. That was the day he walked into that grand hall. The day the director laughed and said, "If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here." And now, sitting again in the quiet of the community hall, the boy smiled faintly at the memory. Life had brought him so far. From that tiny room with a broken piano to a stage where the world listened. But deep inside, he still played for the same reason. For her. As the sun set, the light from the window stretched across the piano, making it glow softly. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play the same melody once more. His fingers moved with ease now, his heart calm. While he played, he thought about the director. He wondered what the man saw in his music that day. Maybe the director understood that behind every note was a story, not of training or theory, but of love and loss. The next morning, he returned to the academy. The staff welcomed him kindly this time. The same assistant from before guided him to a small practice room. "The director wants you to start lessons," the man said with a smile. "You'll meet your tutor soon." The boy nodded, barely able to speak. He ran his fingers over the new piano in the room. It was perfect, smooth, shining, and tuned. When he pressed the first key, the sound filled the space like a soft wave. He had never played anything so perfect before. Later that day, the director walked in. He didn't say much. He just stood near the piano and listened as the boy played. When the tune ended, the director said quietly, "Your music reminds me why I started teaching." The boy looked up, confused but grateful. The director placed a hand on his shoulder. "From now on," he said, "this place is your home. But never forget where you came from. That's where your true song lives." The boy nodded slowly. He understood. That night, after everyone left, he stayed behind in the room, practicing. He played his mother's song again, but this time something new grew inside it. Hope. He could almost imagine her standing behind him, smiling proudly, whispering, "See? I told you you'd make the piano sing. And for the first time in years, he laughed softly through his tears. He didn't feel alone anymore. Outside, the city lights flickered like stars. Inside, a boy who once had nothing but a broken piano had finally found a place where his music could live. Not just as a memory, but as a gift to the world. And though many people would one day know his name, to him, the music would always belong to one person, the woman who believed in him before anyone else did. Days turned into weeks, and the boy's life began to change in quiet but beautiful ways. He now spent most of his time inside the academy, a place that had once felt distant and impossible. The halls were wide and bright, filled with the sounds of different instruments and voices blending together like a living song. Everywhere he turned, someone was practicing, rehearsing, or talking about music. At first, he felt lost among them. The other students came from families that could afford tutors and lessons since childhood. They carried expensive sheet music, spoke confidently, and played with perfect technique. He didn't. His clothes were still plain, his hands rough, and his notes often stumbled when nerves got in the way. But the boy had something else, something no one could teach. He had heart. Every morning, he arrived early, long before the others. The hallways were empty then, quiet enough that he could hear his footsteps echo. He would sit at the piano, close his eyes, and let his fingers find the keys. He didn't always know what he was playing, but it always came from deep inside him. The teachers at the academy soon began to notice him. They saw how he never gave up even when he made mistakes. Some of them would stop by the practice room and listen silently for a few minutes before continuing on. Word began to spread through the academy about the boy who played from the heart. One afternoon, the director stood by the door as the boy practiced. He didn't say anything at first, he just watched quietly. The music was soft and slow, but full of emotion. When the tune ended, the director stepped forward and said, "You remind me of someone I used to know, someone who played not for fame but for love." The boy looked up, surprised. "Was he a student here?" The director smiled faintly. "No, he was me, a long time ago." The boy didn't know how to answer. The director's eyes softened, and he added, "Don't ever lose that feeling when you play. That's what makes you different." Then he turned and walked away, leaving the boy sitting there with a strange warmth in his heart. In the weeks that followed, the director began to spend more time guiding him. He would sit during practice sessions, correcting his posture, helping him understand the rhythm and phrasing. Sometimes he'd scold him gently when he got distracted, but other times he'd simply listen, lost in thought. One day, the director announced that the academy would be holding its annual performance, a grand event where the best students would play for a live audience, including sponsors and guests from across the country. The winner would receive a scholarship to study abroad. The news filled the academy with excitement. Students practiced harder than ever, the air buzzing with ambition and competition. The boy, however, didn't think about winning. He just wanted to play. But deep inside, he wondered if he could stand on that stage, the same stage where great musicians had performed, and tell his story through his song. When he asked the director if he could join, the man nodded slowly. "You're not ready." "In the traditional sense," he said, "but maybe that's what makes you perfect for it. Music is not about perfection, it's about connection. Let's see if your heart can reach theirs." From that day on, the boy practiced every morning and night. He replayed the same melody, refining it little by little. The song had grown with him. It wasn't just a memory of his mother anymore. It had become a reflection of everything he'd lived through: the laughter, the loss, the pain, and the hope. Sometimes he'd stop playing and stare at the piano keys, thinking of her. He could still hear her voice telling him, "If you love it, play it." Those words pushed him through his tiredness. Finally, the day of the performance arrived. The academy's grand hall was filled with people. The golden lights shimmered across the walls, and the audience buzzed with anticipation. Cameras flashed, and the sound of chatter echoed through the room. The boy stood backstage, dressed in a simple black suit borrowed from one of the teachers. His hands were trembling slightly, but his eyes were calm. He peeked through the curtain, The hall looked even bigger than he remembered. Hundreds of people seated, the grand piano gleaming under the stage lights. The director stood near the front row, his face unreadable but his eyes watching closely. One by one, the other performers went up. Each one played beautifully. Fast pieces, complex harmonies, flawless transitions. The audience clapped politely, after every performance appreciating the skill and control. But the boy noticed something. Though the music was perfect, it didn't feel alive. It was beautiful, but distant. When his turn came, the host called his name. A hush fell over the hall as he walked to the piano. He could feel hundreds of eyes following him. His heart raced, but he remembered his mother's words. "Play like you're talking to me." He sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. For a brief moment, he didn't move. The silence stretched. Even the director held his breath. Then softly, the first note rang through the air. It was gentle, almost fragile, but it carried something real. As he continued, the melody began to grow, smooth and emotional, rising and falling like waves. It wasn't perfect. There were small mistakes, but somehow they made it even more beautiful. The audience leaned in, drawn to the sound. The music seemed to reach into their hearts, touching something they didn't know was there. The boy didn't see the crowd anymore. In his mind, he was back in that tiny room with the broken piano, his mother beside him, smiling proudly. He played the final part of the song with all his heart. Each note felt like a whisper, a goodbye, a promise kept. When the last sound faded, he lifted his hands slowly and let the silence take over. For a long moment, no one moved. The hall was completely still. Then someone in the back started clapping softly. Another joined. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause, not polite, but loud and genuine. Some people stood. Some wiped tears from their eyes. The boy looked up, stunned. He had never seen anything like it. The director stood too, his eyes glassy. He clapped once slowly, then again. His expression softened into something rare, pride. He whispered to himself, "I said I'd kneel if he played, and maybe I should." When the boy walked off the stage, the other students congratulated him. Many of them looked at him differently now, not with judgment, but with respect. Later that evening, the director found him sitting alone by the piano. The applause had faded, the hall empty except for the two of them. The boy was tracing his fingers along the keys, still lost in the moment. The director walked up behind him and said quietly, "You did something no one else did tonight." The boy looked up, unsure what to say. "You made the room feel." The director continued, "That's something no amount of training can teach." The boy smiled softly. "I just played what I felt, sir." The director nodded. "And that's why you'll go far." They sat there in silence for a moment. The hall, once filled with sound, now held only the faint echo of what had been. Finally, the director said, "I've been in this world of music for a long time. I've heard countless performances, seen many prodigies. But today, for the first time in years, I remembered why I fell in love with music." The boy looked at him with quiet gratitude. The director continued, "Your song, it wasn't just music, it was life. Keep that no matter how big you become." The boy nodded, unable to speak. When the director left, the boy stayed behind, pressing one last chord on the piano. The sound lingered in the air, gentle and pure. He looked around the hall that once made him nervous and realized it no longer scared him. This was where he belonged now. That night, as he walked home under the streetlights, the city felt different. The light seemed warmer, the sound softer. He didn't need to say a word. His heart was full. He had played his song, and the world had listened. Somewhere, he knew, his mother would have been proud. And far behind him, in that grand hall, the director stood alone on the stage for a moment longer. He looked at the piano and whispered, "You made me remember." Then, without hesitation, he bowed his head. not out of defeat, but in respect. The room was empty, but it didn't feel silent anymore. The music had changed it. It had changed them both. The next morning, sunlight spilled softly through the academy windows. The stage from last night's performance was being cleared. Workers folded chairs and carried away decorations, but the memory of the music still seemed to hang in the air. The grand piano stood in the middle of the hall, quiet now, yet full of something that could not be erased. The director arrived early. He walked slowly across the empty hall, his shoes echoing against the wooden floor. He stopped by the piano and rested his hand on it for a long moment. His mind replayed the boy's performance and the trembling first note, the quiet strength that followed, and the way it had silenced everyone in the room. He had heard hundreds of performances over the years, many by gifted students who practiced day and night, but none of them had moved him the way that song did. It was not perfect, but it was true. It reached into his heart and pulled out emotions he thought he had buried long ago. He sat down at the piano and pressed a single key. The note echoed faintly lonely in the huge room. He let out a soft sigh. There was a time when he used to play with that same kind of feeling, when music wasn't about status or skill, but about expression. Somewhere along the way, as he climbed higher in his career, he had lost that. Later that day, he called for the boy to come to his office. When the boy entered, he still looked unsure of himself, like he hadn't yet accepted what had happened the night before. The director motioned for him to sit. "You played beautifully," he said simply. The boy nodded, his eyes lowered. "Thank you, sir. Do you realize what you did last night?" The boy frowned slightly, unsure. "I just played what I felt." The director smiled faintly. "Exactly. That's what none of the others did. They played to impress. You played to speak." The boy didn't know how to respond. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then the director stood up, walked to the window, and said softly, "Do you know why I said those words that day, Khan, when I laughed and said I'd kneel if you could play?" The boy shook his head. "I said it because I didn't believe in you," the director admitted. "You came in wearing old clothes, trembling, saying you'd never had a teacher. I thought you were another dreamer chasing an impossible wish. I was wrong." The boy looked surprised, almost uncomfortable. "Sir, you don't have to—" The director turned to face him. "No, I do. You reminded me that music isn't something to measure. It's something to feel. You taught me that." The boy's eyes softened. "You taught me too, sir." "You gave me a chance," the director smiled faintly. "Maybe we both taught each other." A silence followed. Not awkward, but peaceful. The kind that comes when two souls understand each other without words. After a moment, the director said, "There's someone I'd like you to meet." He led the boy down the hall to a small room where a woman was playing the violin. Her notes were sharp but beautiful. She stopped when they entered and looked up with a curious smile. "This is one of our former students," the director said. "She performs with the National Orchestra now." The boy's eyes widened slightly. The woman smiled warmly. "I heard about your performance last night," she said. "It takes courage to play like that in front of everyone." He blushed slightly. "Thank you." She looked at him kindly. "Don't ever lose that honesty in your playing. It's rare." The director watched them, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He realized that maybe the academy wasn't just a place for teaching music. It was a place for rediscovering it. In the following weeks, the boy became somewhat of a quiet inspiration for others. Younger students began to talk about him, not because he was the best, but because he played with something they all wanted to feel. When he practiced, people would sometimes gather outside the room, listening through the door in silence. The director watched this change with quiet pride. He didn't make any announcements or speeches about it. He didn't need to. He simply let the music do the talking. One evening, he walked into the practice hall and found the boy sitting at the piano, not playing, just staring at the keys. "Why did you stop?" the director asked gently. The boy looked up. "I was thinking about what comes next." The director smiled. "What do you mean?" "I never thought this far," the boy admitted. "All I wanted was to play. But now people expect more from me. What if I can't live up to it?" The director chuckled softly. "Pressure is part of every artist's life. But remember, the world doesn't need another perfect player. It needs real ones. As long as you stay true, you'll never fail." The boy nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. The director continued. "And as for what comes next? There's a scholarship audition in 2 months. The same one I once took. I think you should try. The boy's eyes widened. Me? But I'm not ready. You'll never feel ready, the director interrupted gently. No one ever does. Just play your truth again. That's all you need. The boy hesitated, then nodded. I'll try. Over the next several weeks, the academy buzzed with excitement again as students prepared for the scholarship auditions. The boy worked harder than ever, spending long nights at the piano, his fingers aching but his heart strong. The director guided him closely, helping him shape the emotion of the piece without losing its soul. Sometimes, when they practiced together, the director would sit beside him and play small parts of the melody. Their notes would blend, old experience meeting young spirit, and for those moments the room would feel complete. One night, after everyone had gone home, the director stayed behind again. He sat at the piano alone and began to play, the same song the boy had performed weeks ago. His version was slower, heavier, full of memory. When he reached the end, he closed his eyes. He realized he hadn't played for himself in years. Every note he'd played in the past decade had been for an audience, for approval, for reputation. But now, for the first time in a long while, he played simply because it made him feel alive. The next morning, he called a meeting with the academy staff. He announced something that left them surprised. He would be stepping down as director after the scholarship auditions. I've given my years to this place, he said quietly, and it has given me more than I could ever ask. But I think it's time I return to what I love most, playing. The room fell silent. One of the teachers spoke up. Are you sure, sir? You've built this academy into what it is. The director nodded, and now it's time for new hands to guide it. I've remembered why I started, thanks to one student. Everyone understood who he meant. That evening, when the boy heard the news, he ran to find the director. You're leaving? He asked, his voice full of surprise. The director smiled gently. Not leaving, just changing direction. But the academy needs you. He shook his head. It will be fine. It has people like you now, people who remind others what music really means. The boy was quiet for a moment, then said softly, You changed my life. The director looked at him kindly. And you changed mine. They stood there in the empty hallway, the sound of distant music echoing faintly through the walls. In the days that followed, the academy prepared for the scholarship auditions. The boy practiced tirelessly, his song more powerful than ever. But this time it wasn't just for himself. It was for everyone who had believed in him, for his mother, for the director, and for the music that had carried him from silence to sound. The director watched him quietly from the back of the room one last time before his departure. There was pride in his eyes, but also peace. He had once laughed at the thought of kneeling for a boy who could play, but now he understood that kneeling wasn't about defeat. It was about respect, for the art, for the journey, and for the heart that made it possible. When the boy finished his final practice that night, the director approached him and said softly, Promise me one thing. What is it? The boy asked. Never play to impress. Play to express. As long as you do that, the world will always listen. The boy nodded firmly. I promise. The director smiled, and for the first time in years, he felt free. As he walked out of the academy doors that night, the sound of the piano followed him, not as an echo of the past, but as the beginning of something new. The morning of the scholarship audition arrived with a calm sky. The air was cool, and a soft breeze carried the faint smell of rain that had fallen overnight. The boy woke early, his heart already racing. He sat by the small window of his dorm room, watching the sunlight touch the edge of the city. The streets below were beginning to fill with people, but for him everything was quiet. He had waited for this day for weeks, yet now that it was here, he didn't feel nervous, only grateful. He touched the edge of the small wooden bracelet on his wrist, the one his mother had made for him years ago. It was old and worn, but it gave him strength. He whispered softly, I'll play for you today. At the academy, the main hall had been transformed again, more grand than before. A long red curtain framed the stage, and banners hung high above with golden letters. Students from across the country had gathered to compete. Some carried their instruments in polished cases. Others clutched sheet music with trembling hands. There was excitement, fear, and pride in the air, a mix that only moments like this could create. The boy arrived quietly. He didn't have an entourage or a fancy uniform. His suit was the same one he'd worn at the last performance. But his eyes carried something stronger than confidence, a quiet fire. The director, though no longer holding his position, was there too. He stood near the back of the hall, his hands in his coat pockets, watching the stage. He didn't want to draw attention. He had come not as a judge or a mentor this time, but as someone who simply wanted to witness. When the auditions began, the room filled with one performance after another. Violins, cellos, flutes, and pianos echoed through the hall. Each player was talented, their hands moving swiftly with skill that came from years of practice. The judges nodded, making notes, their faces calm and professional. The boy sat near the end of the line, listening. Every time someone finished, the applause rose and faded, leaving only silence again. He didn't compare himself to them. He knew their music was perfect, but he also knew something else. That perfection without feeling was empty. He didn't want to impress anyone. He just wanted to tell his story one more time. Finally, his name was called. The noise in the hall softened as he walked to the stage. His steps were steady, though his heart thumped in his chest. He could feel hundreds of eyes following him. Somewhere among them, he knew the director was watching. He sat at the piano and took a deep breath. His hands rested on the keys, still for a moment. He could almost hear his mother's voice again, calm, gentle, and full of love. If you love it, play it. The first note rang out, soft and low like a whisper. Then another followed, building slowly into a melody that filled the hall. The room seemed to grow smaller as his music spread through it, weaving itself around every listener. The song he played was new, but it carried traces of the one he'd performed before. It had grown with him. Now it was fuller, richer, a song about everything he had lived through. The laughter of his childhood, the loss, the struggle, the hope, and the guidance he had found in unexpected places. His fingers moved with grace, not forced, but natural. Every rise and fall in the melody carried a piece of emotion. It wasn't perfect. A few notes trembled, some pressed too soft, but that imperfection made it human. The audience was silent. Even the judges stopped writing. The boy's eyes were closed, his face calm. He wasn't just playing a piano, he was opening his soul. The director, standing in the back, felt a lump form in his throat. He had promised himself he wouldn't get emotional, but he couldn't help it. He had seen this boy come from nothing, from the edge of being dismissed, and now here he was, holding an entire room in stillness. As the song neared its end, the melody slowed. The final notes came out soft as a breath, fading like a memory. The boy's hands lingered over the keys before he lifted them and let silence take over. For a moment, there was no sound at all. The air felt heavy with emotion. Then, as if a wave broke, the audience rose to their feet, clapping loudly, some even shouting in admiration. The boy stood, his head bowed slightly, unsure what to do. The judges were standing too, their faces filled with something between awe and disbelief. One of them said softly, "That was not just music. That was truth." He walked off the stage, his heart still racing. He didn't know if he would win. It didn't matter. He had given everything he had. Backstage, he found the director waiting for him. The man's eyes were glistening, though he tried to hide it behind a small smile. "You did it," the director said quietly. The boy nodded, still catching his breath. "I played what I felt." The director chuckled softly. "I know. I could feel it too." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of applause still echoing faintly from the hall. Then the director said, "You've grown, you know. Not just as a musician, as a person." The boy smiled. "Because you taught me to listen." The director shook his head. "No, you taught me to remember." Hours later, when the results were announced, the boy's name was called first. He had won the scholarship. The hall erupted in applause again. Reporters took pictures, students cheered, and teachers congratulated him. But amid all the celebration, his eyes searched for one person, the director. He found him standing quietly near the doorway, away from the crowd. Their eyes met, and that was enough. No words were needed. That night, after everyone had left, the boy returned to the stage one last time. The hall was empty again, just as it had been the morning after his first performance. He sat down at the piano and touched the keys gently. The wood felt warm under his fingers. He didn't play a full song this time. just a few simple notes, soft, like a goodbye. When he finished, he whispered, "Thank you." At the same time, in another part of the city, the director was sitting by a window in his small apartment. A cup of tea rested on the table beside him. He had taken out an old photograph, a picture of himself as a young man standing beside his first piano. He smiled faintly. He could still hear the boy's music in his mind. It had reignited something inside him, not ambition but purpose. The next morning he began playing again, not for an audience but for himself. The notes came slow and uncertain at first, but soon they began to flow, full of warmth. As days passed, the boy prepared to leave for his scholarship abroad. The academy arranged a small farewell gathering for him. Teachers and students gathered in the hall, and the director, though no longer part of the staff, came too. When it was his turn to speak, the boy stood in front of everyone, nervous but sincere. "I don't have many words," he said softly, "but I want to thank this place for believing in someone like me. And I want to thank the man who once laughed at me, because his laughter turned into guidance, and that guidance changed my life." Everyone looked toward the director. He lowered his head slightly, humbled. The hall filled with gentle applause. Before leaving, the boy approached him one last time. "You once said you'd kneel if I could play," he said with a smile. The director chuckled. "I remember," the boy continued softly. "Please don't kneel. Just keep playing." The director's eyes softened. "I will. And wherever you go, keep playing too. Not to be heard, but to be felt." The boy nodded. "I promise." They shook hands, firm and steady. It wasn't just a farewell. It was a passing of something deeper, like a spark from one soul to another. When the boy walked out of the academy for the last time, the sun was setting. The city lights began to flicker on, and the air was filled with the sounds of life. He looked back once, seeing the tall building where his journey had begun. Then he smiled and walked forward. Somewhere behind him, the director stood at the window, watching him go. He whispered quietly, "If he plays again someday, the world will listen." And somewhere, perhaps in some unseen place, a mother's spirit smiled, proud and at peace, because her son had kept his promise. Music had brought them all together, changed them, healed them. And as long as someone played with heart, it would never truly end. The hall stood silent again that night, but if anyone had walked in, they might have sworn they heard a faint melody, soft, full of life and endlessly true.